on several issues. Are you recording yet?
Yeah, she just
okay, recording. Okay, we're recording and we are called to order. So I'm going to first turn it over to Sean for a few comments.
All right, so good afternoon, commissioners and guests. I just want to take a quick moment to introduce our presenters today. So first off, excuse me, we have some staff presentations by John Purvis, our General Superintendent and Power Supply Manager, and then followed by him will be Tyler King, our Power Analyst. John's going to talk about some opportunities and challenges here on the North Olympic Peninsula. And then Tyler's going to go into a little bit of detail about our current contract, which is called the Regional Dialogue Contract. And it's important to kind of get a baseline with some of the terminology there so that it makes sense when we talk about the next contract, which is called the Provider of Choice. And then after that, John's going to follow up again with a few slides to talk about sort of some timelines with where we're at with the Provider of Choice contract. And then after John, we have Ryan Neal here with us today. Very happy to have him. He's an attorney with the Western Public Agencies Group, or WPAG for short. And Ryan is a subject matter expert in pretty much all things BPA and has been working on this contract since about 2019. So thank you, Ryan, for making the drive out here today. We sincerely appreciate it. I know that your presentation will be engaging, just like all the other ones that we get to attend with you. There is a lot of information today. There's about 80 slides that we're going to try to get through. So we ask that we save questions and answers until after everybody's had a chance to present to make sure that we get through all the material. However, if you do have questions that are germane to a specific slide, please feel free to raise your hand so that we can answer questions. Maybe you don't understand an acronym or a definition or something like that. We're happy to answer those on the fly. So with that, I will turn it over to John to get started, unless the commissioners have any questions for me at this time.
Well, Sean, I'd like to say something. I just would like to recognize that we at Clallam County PUD have been, for the years that I've been here, have been struggling with the strategic aspect of Clallam County, its power, its development, its resources, and how we can sustain, maintain, and even come in at a cheaper rate, work on becoming more cost effective. And so, and this is not the last 20 years. Things have radically changed in the last 20 years. And the approaches we took, 20 years ago may not work today. The power markets have shifted dramatically. Things are changing quicker than people can keep up with them. Prices for certain types of power going, dropping precipitously. At the same time, there's questions about resource availability for raw material supply chains and all that kind of stuff and so forth. And then here at Clallam County, we've been hearing for years, from our constituents and ratepayers that, we want a resilient system. We want a system that, it's green. It's as green as it can get. And whether you believe that, hydropower is green or not, a lot of people say it's not because of the salmon issues and so forth. But nevertheless, we want a mixture of renewable power, wind, solar, battery, and so forth. And so we would like this workshop to be I don't know if it's a starting point, but another step in the process where we're deeply engaged with the public and elected officials in the county and really trying to come up and be bold with some ideas. And we don't want to hide behind the answers we may have given ourselves even a year ago. But if there's something that we want to look at or question, then let's throw it out there and let's dig into it. And if it's okay with Commissioner Hayes, I would like, maybe see a list of objectives at the end of the meeting, that, here's the things that we said we would look into and do a little, kind of analysis and get back. And so that we don't lose this. And so we don't just sit here and have another meeting, but we have a meeting with some goals and objectives that lay out, that become part of our strategic plan, or in fact, they're things that are very tactical that we could do right away. And so to do that, though, we need to hear from you. And so we want to encourage conversation. And I appreciate Sean's comment about, the time we have, but do ask a question. If you see something on the slide that you don't understand, please ask a question. This is a learning session here, and we don't want you walking away, flip a slide goes by and you go, well, I guess I didn't have time to really get into that one, or so forth. So, but we'll try to keep the progress going and keep things going. So anyway, again, welcome. And if you haven't signed in when, at the break or something, please sign in. We'd appreciate that. Okay, so thank you. John? Did you want to say anything?
No, I'm good. Actually, I do. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Everything Jim said, I think, is absolutely right on. But I want to emphasize when we talk about resilience, energy resilience in particular, but for us, it's not just energy resilience, it's water resource resilience. We're talking about here at home. So much of the focus on the energy industry within the federal Columbia River power system is region-wide, finding ways to augment the system and enhance the system and diversify portfolio, which is great. But, here in Clallam County, we're at the end of a very long extension cord, and we have no, generation here in the county, and we only have power served from us from one direction. We have some redundancy, but we don't have an energy loop. So resiliency is important for us here for very specific reasons, particularly with regards to, extreme weather events or heaven forbid, catastrophic events. Our general manager has stated to the Department of Energy group that was here last fall that, we would probably be one of the first counties to be load shedded. So for us here, it's extremely important that we find ways to take advantage of the technologies we have today to provide some of that resiliency. And we feel like the rest of the energy industry isn't always on board with doing that so much as they are defending the existing hydropower system, which is vitally important, but also or nuclear, which has potential, but they seem to be generally sort of ignoring wind and water in combination, wind and solar in combination with water resources. So that's part of my concern, specifically with respect to the BPA post 2028 contract and how it could restrict or constrict our ability to incorporate some of those alternative energy resources into our system here to provide some of that resilience and energy independence.
Thanks. Thanks.
And Commissioner Waddell, I just want to point out that Commissioner Pascal is attending via Zoom.
Rick, would you like to say something?
No comment.
Thanks. Okay.
Okay, welcome. Good afternoon, commissioners. Good afternoon, public. Nicole, I'd like to bring up my presentation. As Jim mentioned, this is a pretty substantial presentation. We're going to try to go through the slides fairly quick, but if you have questions or something isn't clear, feel free to ask questions, raise your hand, and we'll do our best to answer that. Okay, I'm going to do a portion of the presentation that discusses local power opportunities and challenges, somewhat touching on some of the comments from the board. And as a quick overview, we're required to report our fuel mix to the Department of Commerce, and these numbers are pretty typical for our utility as far as fuel mix. Of course, hydro makes up about 85% of our supply. Nuclear generally 10 to 11%. And a little bit of wind that BPA has procured, but primarily we're interested in the unspecified, which is another word for carbon power, meaning that those purchases are generally made periodically at small intervals to take care of transients and swings in the power supply where they need to augment temporarily their system. Okay, we're also interested in the Washington State aggregate fuel mix for the entire state, because we are thinking about CETA going forward. And if you look at Washington in total, as is mentioned, solar right now is a very small fraction of the Washington supply. Wind is a little bit higher, about 3%, or excuse me, 5%. But one thing to note, the coal percentage for Washington at 10%, that is going away very soon, 2025 per CETA. And that's going to have to be replaced. And it's going to be replaced with something very likely a non-carbon source. Later on than CETA, by 2045, natural gas and unspecified power totaling almost 14% or 24% of the supply for the state will be going away by CETA legislation. There's going to have to be new resources brought online to fill those gaps over the next contract. Okay, now this is a little bit busy, but this is to give you an idea of our forecasting. Our current load, average load, is about 77 average megawatts, and that's represented by the yellow, light yellow, orangey area, and that's where we are today. Now, offsetting that is something called our conservation obligation according to our CPA down at the bottom. There's a slither at the bottom that says that we're obligated or will be expected to conduct cost-effective conservation to the tune of about 14 average megawatts over the next 30 years. And that will reduce our obligation. We also have distributed generation that's going to increase from an average of 0.5 megawatt to about 2.5, and a capacity of about 14 megawatts. So, okay, so our loads are expected to go down if everything stayed the same, but of course, we're going to have load growth. That pink slither represents our consistent load growth over the last decade, and that's going to raise our obligation and be fairly flat over the contract. But we also have vehicle electrification, and that's going to go into high gear by the end of this decade, and over the term of the 30 years I have shown here is going to result in a 30% increase in electrical load per our projections. That's going to have to be served by non-carbon sources. So basically, this is what the end result is. We are going to have to acquire, either through our own efforts or through collaboration with others, a lot of power. Between 2028 and 2045, we're looking at probably close to 16 average megawatts of new power over and beyond what we use now. Now, we don't know what the starting point is yet. That's part of the provider of choice discussions, but short answer, we have a lot of power we're going to have to provide. We're going to need resources for it. Tier 2, other dedicated resources. Okay, and Jim touched on this. So the power markets are far different than they were now than they were previously in the current regional dialogue or the current contract. It's kind of busy, but if you look at the green line, that is basically the BPA Tier 1 rate over time. And we project that into the future based on the BP24 rate case. And it appears to be fairly stable. And then the blue line, which goes above and below and above again, the Tier 1 rate is called the BPA Tier 2 rate. That is power that's not directly associated with the hydro system. That's what BPA goes out and it's not a direct procurement, but they go out and they allocate a portion of power that we receive at that rate. And there's about half the BPA customers are assessed at that rate for above contract high watermark requirements. The orange line is basically an annual weighted average of electricity cost over time. Now, throughout most of the regional dialogue, I would say that those costs generally have fallen below BPA costs. But beginning in 2020, market prices have dramatically risen. And if we do the forward futures on the Mid-C, we're looking at market prices north of $80 a megawatt hour, and as we go into the next contract. And if you look at those costs compared to some of the other options that are available, there's a lot of power options that are becoming cost effective for serving tier 2 obligations. Okay, what's going on? Now, I don't know. I'm not really a power marketeer, but these are the things that I've been told. Okay, global events, sustained elevated natural gas prices, resource adequacy margins on the Western Interconnect, including California, inadequate regional market capacity or volume is contributing, state decarbonization legislation, California, Oregon, and Washington, and discount impacts on resource costs, including what is called levelized cost of energy, which is a way of measuring resource cost. Okay, consequences and opportunities. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty in the future BPA contract details, and that alone is an impediment to resource development because nobody knows where we're going to start off the next contract. So we don't know what the augmentation or options are, the cost, system size, allocations. It's not established yet. Carbon content. Now, it is believed that BPA Tier 1 hydro is expected to probably be the most competitive non-carbon source, at least in the initial years of the next contract. You see that on the chart. It's almost guaranteed. But at the same time, new renewable generation is likely to be lower cost than market-based BPA Tier 2 is structured in the current contract. If Tier 2 is north of, say, $60 a megawatt hour, there's other options that we'll have to consider, and we got to make the right decision. Okay, these are EIA reporting for legacy renewable sources. These are sources that came on over the last 10 to 12 years. And early development of renewables had a little bit of a financial penalty to them. They tended to be a little bit higher cost. These costs today would generally be lower, but these were brought on either to serve Tier 2 requirements or something that they had a deficit in if they're not a BPA customer. As you can see, the best price that we could find based on reporting was $60 an average megawatt for a rich man's solar plant.
John, when EIA was reporting 2021 for legacy, what year were they actually reporting? Up to 2021, or was that just the date of the report and there's the actual legacy date is preceding that?
My understanding, those are financial numbers for 2021 reported, but it includes resources developed numerous years beforehand. So if PSE brought on a wind farm in 2018, that's part of the reporting. Is that correct, Tyler?
Thanks.
Okay, this is very busy. I want to focus on the highlighted section. I mentioned the high cost of renewables, from 5-10 years ago. Looking forward, according to the Energy Information Administration, some resource constrained technologies such as onshore wind and solar are currently at current capacity factors being brought on to supply, expected in year 2024 using 2021 dollars, is looking at some costs as low as $29 or $30 per megawatt hour, which is pretty competitive. Of course, there's a substantial levelized tax credit to that as well. So when we look at resources, this is the kind of stuff we need to be looking at.
And when you say levelized capital, you want to explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, levelized cost of energy is basically trying to create an equivalency on a megawatt hour basis for the investment and the capital to construct a facility, as well as to operate the facility over the life of the facility.
And what term, the term of that lifespan is going to be different for each of the different resources?
Very much so. So basically, right now, for most solar projects, 25 years is what people look at, but that's moving towards 30 with longer life equipment. A nuclear plant, if you're going to do an honest appraisal, needs to probably look at an extended period of time with potential refueling to get an equality. And one thing to note, that you can't really compare dispatchable versus resource constrained. There's a difference. So you have to be careful in direct comparisons, but it does give you an idea, at least with respect to particular types of resources, which is the lowest cost.
So the combined cycle under dispatchable technologies, is that hydro and nuclear?
No, combined cycle is natural gas with a secondary generation steam loop. I will get into that a little bit later in the presentation, or at least touch on that. But this is U.S. Energy, as part of the Department of Energy. And they collect all the data and information. They keep record of it for many years into the past. No, I'll have that later in the presentation, though. Oh, basically, we're looking at levelized cost of energy, and we need to make decisions on future power cost based on this type of information. And we're also looking at, for resources brought on in 2027, they likewise have a levelized cost of energy. It changes a little bit because the tax credits go down on some sources and they go up on others. So when we compare BPA cost, tier 2 cost, we're looking at levelized cost of energy for a cost comparison. So to see what the rate impact would be.
So if we wanted to do a little analysis on a 100 kilowatt solar project, we would use this information to determine the benefit cost ratio, or would we do an independent, here's 100 kilowatts, here's how much it costs, here's how much we can charge for it?
We would have to do an independent. These numbers are based on utility scale solar projects on the order of 100 megawatts and assumed capacity factors. And a little bit further in the presentation, I'll bring this local.
Yeah, because that's what we want to, what's in it for Clallam, the Clallam County issue here.
Well, it doesn't look, Nicole, you're going to have to advance me. Yeah, there's a lot of resilience opportunities that we're looking into and others in our county. And those grants basically make many projects cost viable when otherwise they would not be. Randy, do you have a question?
Yeah, I did want to get some clarification on full versus resource constrained. Those two terms, please.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, to get a definition of dispatchable power sources versus resource constrained.
Okay, yes, good point. A dispatchable technology is a technology that you can call on and be available when you need it at a certain competence. A resource constrained technology is a resource that is dependent upon attributes that are not necessarily related to when you use the energy, such as intermittent wind and solar.
Would hydro be resource constrained then?
Say again, sir?
Would hydro be resource constrained?
In a sense, yes. Now, the BPA Tier 1 system identifies what is called a critical water year. And from BPA's perspective, that largely means they consider that portion dispatchable. But the hydro generated in excess of the critical water year is really more dispatchable, I would call it.
So if
John,
it's a water year, what if with climate change there's less rain? Then does the critical water year drop?
The total water probably does not change much, but when it happens within a year, can dramatically change. And it will change the shape of the annual BPA generation.
So that does sound like another variable that needs to be analyzed on a risk basis.
Yes, that's absolutely true. In 2021, I believe BPA was directed to incorporate that analysis in their future plan.
Okay.
Ronald Richards?
Yeah, I just want to say I'm hearing answers to questions, but I don't hear any part of the question. Is there any way you could repeat the question?
Yes, I will try to repeat the question before I respond to it.
Thank you.
Are you finished, John, with him? I've got a question on the slide about resource constrained technologies, hydroelectric. It shows 54%. Now, if we had a project that was, say, 30% was the constraint, how would it affect these numbers across to the right? Would they all go up, they go down, or what?
Dramatically.
Like what?
They were dramatically changed based on the capacity factor quoted. These numbers are averages for the United States, and I will get into the impacts on the next screen, how that might affect us in some examples.
So, okay, so if the capacity factor was lower, then the prices, your total LCOE would go up?
Yes, I mean, no, if your capacity factors increase, the levelized cost of energy would go down. If interest rates increase, the levelized cost will go up.
Okay, thanks.
It's not forwarding the call.
John, before you go on, I'm sorry. Capacity resource technologies, you got combustion turbine and battery storage. Is there any data to date on what combining those, particularly battery storage, with the other resource constrained technology, wouldn't that transform them into being dispatchable within a narrow time frame?
Yes, Nicole, can you back up slide real quick? I did it myself, huh? Okay. Okay, yes. Yeah, so basically a combustion turbine or basically a single cycle natural gas generation that is typically used in California for peak loading, and they only operate about 10% of the time. That's why it has a very low capacity factor and a fairly high cost for the levelized cost of energy. Battery storage can be paired with an intermittent source, but it will not make it dispatchable over the long term, but the battery can shape the generation to match load, meaning like in California, they generate a lot in the afternoon. They have an evening peak. When they use 2 and 4 hour batteries, they're able to ship that generation into the evening hour peak and meet their requirements. Okay, looking wind potential. If you look at the country as a whole, you have a large area in the midsection that has very good wind capacity factors, the darker blue areas. You also see in the coastal areas, pretty good wind as well, meaning capacity factors that can be in the 40% range or higher. Now in Washington, you have some areas on the east side of the Cascades that are I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, but if you look offshore, we do have some potential off the coast. Now we do have some wind challenges in our area. It's significant. It is entirely within the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. That's important. And it's also within one of 4 coastal tribe UNA treaty rights, which, in many respects gives tribes authority to approve or not, as it does impact many marine situations, wells, fish, otherwise. And if we were going to ever do an offshore wind project, I personally would favor that being a tribal initiated project. There are capacity restrictions. Our PED transmission line to Neah Bay is capped out at about 29 megawatts. The BPA line from Sappho, Port Angeles to Sappho is about 117 megawatts. And most offshore wind to be more viable are looking to start at about a 250 to 400 megawatt level. There was an interest in the Quinault area, Grace Harbor, but they ran into Grace Harbor transmission restrictions, not unlike what our restrictions would be if we had development of wind in our service territory.
It seems like the potential for offshore on Washington's coast, including working around the challenges of the marine sanctuary, which my understanding is the Marine Sciences Lab here spent quite a bit of time, a decade or so ago, mapping to understand how not only fish and marine mammals, but even fauna, even the kelp migration patterns work. And they always believed it was possible to deploy offshore wind there, do that without disrupting the biology or the environment. And if we could partner with the tribes, it seems like the potential for generation is enormous. You could transmit power down the coast. So I guess without going on, my point is, why aren't we looking at that? Why isn't DOE or others or BPA looking at that and starting to plan and figure out how to build the transmission capacity? Because that's really the roadblock, as near as I can tell.
Well, yeah, very, very good points. Now, PNNL is in collaboration with the tribes on discussing projects. We do not have as much information on what's going on. We talk to McCog, we give them capacity limitations, transformer sizes for potential projects. And we would be, very happy to collaborate on any wind project with PNNL, with the tribes, if that is their interest for wind development. We'll do what we can to make it happen. Of course, the transmission capacity is going to be a constraint until that is, eliminated.
So working with the tribes, can we initiate that? Can that be one of our strategic objectives, is to have an offshore wind initiative?
Yeah, we can. I would recommend that we probably set up a meeting to discuss with all the tribes what their interests are on potential development of generation resources off the coast. And we don't want to be an impediment to that as a utility.
That would definitely be a piece of that. Ken, what do you think?
Well, I think it makes sense. I think, the approach has to be to make sure the tribes understand that we're not trying to just do something on their land
Right,
or take
exactly.
their land, because it was highly resistant to that. But I think, it's a great opportunity for them to, as a revenue source, and to, be part of the equation from a controlling side. I think would be very receptive. They would be very receptive to it, quite honestly.
Yeah, and that is exactly, staff position. We would like to be a collaboration, and we would not in any way want to seem to be trying to impose on sovereign rights.
I
Right.
think if the tribes are on board or interested in this, it would go a long ways to alleviating the issues with the bird sanctuary.
Yeah, sure. And we had feedback at the November Nordic meeting about this, and from PNL, and they're anxious to go and say they got cash. So
All right, I believe we have a question from Glenn Ellis.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yes, we can hear you, Glenn.
Yeah, hello, Glenn Ellis. I'm the treasurer for the Makah tribe. The reason why the tribes haven't initiated, I guess, a plan for this is that the federal system for how they interact with tribes has not been fixed to our liking. And if anything's happening in our, our UNA that affects our resources in the ocean, whether it's fish, mammals, or, even just the biology of it, we want to be included from the very, very first conversations. And that hasn't been a unanimous, I guess, effort by the federal partners. And so thus far, we have just kind of remained neutral to the idea of it. We don't want to be, pushing something forward that our interests and our resources are not valued, because we manage those resources very, very extensively, and putting big structures and things in there before the science or before the environmental impacts are done is not something that we're terribly interested in. So we really want, we're interested, we want to talk, we want to hear, we want to, know more things. We met with PUD in Bonneville on that meeting a little while ago. It's not something that we're, extremely opposed to, but we just want it to be done where, the things that we hold near and dear and sacred to us are protected.
Thank you. We appreciate that. And both staff and commissioners entirely agree. There's a lot of impacts on offshore wind. You have to relay ground cable structures and many things that can affect marine life that has to be considered before you jump into a project like this.
Yeah, and that was my note of hesitancy in my voice when, saying, well, let's go work with the tribes. It has to be done in a very sovereign way and so forth.
See.
Oh, well, I assume so, but one part of the presentation we prepared to get into those type of situations, but yes, it would have to be considered. Okay, Randy, do you have a question?
Yeah, so along with wind energy, there's also wave energy, and there are scalable energy sources, power energy production sources being tried now, I believe even in Oregon. So is that on your radar at all? It's not something that, is ready for game time yet, but it could be within 5 years or so.
Randy, that's a little bit later in this presentation.
Okay.
Okay, John, let's move along.
Okay, solar, we talked about capacity factors. Now solar, Western Washington solar is fairly low capacity factor. SQUIM may be a little bit higher. Eastern Washington, you get more horizontal radiation, more solar generation for the system size. The most desired area, of course, is in the desert Southwest. Okay, to understand levelized cost of energy at utility scale solar resources, 100 megawatts. And tracking, the fairly expensive, significant systems. And here's an example of how capacity factor affects levelized cost of solar. So if we look at the EIA numbers for 2024, if it was in the Mojave Desert, 32% capacity factor, it would cost $26 per megawatt hour based on the EIA outlook. The average of all US projects, 29% capacity factor, that price increases to $29 per megawatt hour. Now, if we go to Eastern Washington, we're looking at about 23% capacity factor, a little bit more clouds there than you get in the desert Southwest. And that raises the cost of power to $38 per megawatt hour. And if you go to SQUIM, it gets a little bit lower, $48 per megawatt hour, and most of Western Washington is closer to $51 per megawatt hour. This demonstrates the impact of capacity factor on the cost of energy. Now, these are based on numbers published in 2022. Interest rates have gone up. That also affects cost of power, but it affects all sources of power: nuclear, renewable, even gas turbines. Okay, these costs do not include RSS shaping charges, which takes the intermittent renewables and shapes them to a block of power, a constant block of power. BPA generally does this for load following customers by throttling the hydro system, I assume. And they charge for that. There's an adder to the renewables.
Okay, now if the solar's produced right out here, we don't have to pay this, right?
If the solar is produced locally, and I'm sure if it's under 200 kW, we do not have RSS.
Right. Okay, so an observation here is that, these, if first blush is, oh, we don't need to go there because the prices are too high. But given that we're looking at years, in the future, and the fact that these prices for solar are dropping, prices for other things like hydro is going up and so forth. It would seem to me that it would serve us to start laying out, certain, identify some objective kind of projects. In other words, in Squim or down at Neah Bay or if I'm talking solar, probably Squim, and see if we can't, start setting up some projects and see where they take us over the next couple of years, as a matter of getting ahead of the game.
No, we entirely agree, Jim. We're also looking at solar offerings in Richland that are available now at a $45 cost of megawatt hour, $17 RSS. That's very competitive with BPA tier 2 rates today.
And that makes sense for managing average cost, but the solar with 4-hour battery backup, even if you add the shaping cost, from what I'm seeing on the trend on nuclear, it's certainly within that or no more expensive than that, and very easily could be cheaper from what I'm seeing with the cost of continuing for another 40 years at the Columbia Generating Station with the investment that's going to take and the cost for small modular reactors. This is right in there today.
I totally agree. Totally agree. And in emergency resilience needs, there's extra reasons to have power that's entirely reliable. Microgrid applications. Okay, do we have a question? All right, Paul. Did you have a question, Paul?
Thank you. Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify because if you can hear me, the number for Squim says solar standalone, and I get the impression from looking this that we're talking about like a large utility project where you buy a large amount of real estate and fill it with solar, and it makes me think that there's a different model if you're talking about like a microgrid rooftop solar. The cost could be quite different if you're not buying large amounts of real estate and getting large amounts of environmental permits. There may be advantages to that approach. So I just wanted to clarify that the number you're showing here is just one model for solar, and there may be others. Thank you.
Yes, Paul, there are multiple models. We're showing the large utility scale here. A little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about a fixed system, smaller fixed system. Julie, do you have a question? No question from Julie? Okay, EIA costs. You also have NREL costs. They predict a declining cost of solar for utility scale. They actually have 3 scenarios modeled. If you model it 30 years and low interest rate, 3% discount rate, you potentially could have a range anywhere from $40 down to $20, even in Richland, with a lot of unknowns. How much federal support, incentives, how fast does the decline in cost go? Do we have supply chain issues? So it's a wide range, a lot of uncertainty. Even between now and 2030, what is the cost going to be? So there's differences between the EIA and NREL. Just want to point that out. Okay, this is an illustration of power cost over monthly intervals consistent with the BPA BP 24 rate case. And as you see, high load hours, HLA, and low load hours. There's a difference. High load hours are basically during the normal workday, well into the evening. Light load hours is between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. and holidays and Sundays. We also have the BPA Tier 2 rate, which for BP 24 will start out at about $63 megawatt hour. And I did an example where we put a Eastern Washington solar without RSS and the relative capacity factor of that solar to give you basically a monthly cost for power. Now, most of these costs are expressed on an annual basis, but this gives you a good idea of when power is cheap and when power is potentially expensive. And when we make these decisions going forward, we will need to look at this. And we'll need to correlate this to our actual shape. I have boxes. You see where BPA supply is a big change from the last rate case. April, May, and June, the power gets very cheap. For solar production between May and August in Richland, very cheap with those high capacity factors. Okay, resiliency, green hydrogen. Green hydrogen is generally disadvantaged due to commercial round trip efficiency of electrolysis in conjunction with either hydrogen turbine systems or fuel cell systems, more so with the turbine systems. You convert electricity to hydrogen, you lose 20%. When you burn the hydrogen in the turbine, you lose a lot more. So your overall efficiency is typically around 30%. Fuel cell systems a lot better, about 60%, 70%. But if you have tier 1 cost averaging $11 megawatt hour during the 3-month run out period of BP 24, hydrogen can be much more cost effective, even if we generate it here locally, compared to what other areas of the country would have to generate it at. So if we did that, we could conceivably have emergency or resilient generation for up to 1 megawatt. That's a big load. We could use that for demand response. We could use it for supporting fuel cell vehicles. Now, not everyone's going to have a necessarily a lithium ion battery. I think the larger vehicles are probably going to be fuel cell based largely in the next years. That could create a support system. But of course, tier 1 rates change every 2 years. And BPA can change those costs and undermine any initiatives. And likewise, these are developing technologies subject to an expensive learning curve. Not in great detail. I've heard it referenced, but not a close look. Yeah, and the electrolysis is getting better, but it's not a whole lot it can improve from what's ideal. Okay, also green hydrogen again. Okay, let's say we have high solar capacity factors in summer. You can also mitigate poor single-digit capacity factors in winter using hydrogen generation and storage in conjunction with fuel cells. And if a customer is interested in a microgrid for a long-term operation without support from the utility, and not having to worry about either diurnal or seasonal storage, annual storage, that may be a good solution. Now, for fixed racks, they're not quite as effective as the tracking systems. For our SQUIM solar, the average capacity factor throughout the year is about 15%. April and September, it averages about 20%, but in November through January, down to 6%. It's a big distinction. Having a hydrogen storage system could be very effective in microgrid applications, similar to something used with our SQUIM community solar. There's mention about PNNL. We do have a collaboration with PNNL and have for quite a few years, going back almost 20 years, I think. And they are very dedicated researchers into areas of marine energy in our area where there's tremendous potential. That includes tidal, wave action, marine currents. The Straits of Juan de Fuca have 2 knots of current, very predictable. You know when it's going to happen, you can schedule it. You also have salinity and thermal gradients. You have wave action. And what I found most interesting, and it's not quite as glamorous as the carbon capture, they have ways of generating biological systems in marine environments that can be turned into solids without the risk of methane, which would undermine the efforts of carbon capture. But of course, these are early stages of development. In all likelihood, these are a decade or decades away for full commercial viability. Hey, Karen, you have a question?
Yes, John, this is just a comment. Unfortunately, I have to jump off to another meeting where I'm presenting. So I just wanted to say a couple things. One, NODC is a partner with PNNL in a marine renewable energy project that will be kicking off pretty soon. And we'll be leading a community engagement process around the potential for marine renewable energy on the peninsula. So I wanted everybody to know about that. And then secondly, I'm speaking with PNNL this afternoon, and I think we're going to try to convene a meeting about all of the different state and federal funding opportunities that are happening right now, to just try to figure out who's planning to apply for what, and maybe do a little bit of coordination and see where they may be able to provide technical assistance. So stay tuned on that. Just wanted to point out those couple of things. And thank you. This meeting's been very informative.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate your mention of that. Is that the Jamestown project on the marine energy or something else?
It's something else. This is funding from the Department of Energy to look at what it would take to use marine renewable energy in a geographically remote area, and what kinds of what the feasibility looks like in terms of other kinds of sources. When you're talking about a remote area like ours that has only one line coming in, or looking at other kinds of islands or remote areas in Alaska, does that change the feasibility dynamic? And our role will be convening a community advisory board and doing community engagement to find out what kinds of criteria various parts of the community are looking for in assessing a project for marine renewable energy.
All right, thank you very much, Karen. I'm sure we'll be involved in those discussions fairly early on.
Yeah, we really appreciate the partnership of the PUD in all of this.
Okay, it was touched on talking about DOE and Washington Commerce grants. Just be aware that the DOE on the level of $10 billion, $10 billion over several years, are offering grants to all utilities in the country for resiliency grants. The state, through the Department of Commerce, is spending something like $130 million on similar grants. And we're tracking all of those. Resiliency grants includes infrastructure hardening, undergrounding lines, microgrids, vegetation fuel load management, weatherization, monitoring control technologies, renewable energy development, low-income community solar. And this is available to all tribal and local housing authorities, CAP agencies, low-income service providers, food banks, as well as any nonprofit that has a major part of their core mission in support of low-income persons.
You know, can I interrupt for a sec? One of the things I think about a lot in my short tenure as a PUD commissioner is there is so many opportunities right now for funding, for grant funding, and I've been trying to imagine, and I know that our PUD is partnering with other agencies or organizations, but it seems like it would be much more to our benefit to either contract directly or to hire a full-time temporary employee to help us write some of these grants. I mean, grant writing, the quality of the grant, how it's written makes a huge difference, including how it's structured, how you partner and all those things. Has staff been thinking about that and trying to figure out a way we could?
Yes. As a matter of fact, Now, we have partnered with Energy Northwest. They've created a grant monitoring and support system that we can contract with to actually do those activities. Staff has internally learned a lot over the last couple of years on grants. So we have some in-house knowledge, but I will agree with you that writing grants, and I'm sure you saw that in the city, is not really a core function of most utility type employees. You really need somebody as a specialist.
Well, I mean, you have the talent, you just don't have the time.
Exactly.
And
So
to do it right is really time consuming.
absolutely. And more on that later, because we're going to see how this Energy Northwest collaboration works. Okay, so now it's more than just going out for a grant. You have to think about things and what you're going to do. So basically, at the Futures Conference, I threw out an idea how you might collaborate at different levels in support of grant funding for energy projects. So we gave an example where, let's say, a low-income community solar project funded by the state could be funded at almost 100% cost. And a municipal assistance agency can then identify which low-income customers receive that benefit. After that's established, let's say another municipal agency, emergency management, wants a microgrid for emergency functions. They can then bring on a battery or fuel cell or addition for the source that's already established for low-income community solar that feeds into this microgrid. And the additional costs for making that a microgrid with battery can be funded at up to 70%. Lastly, the agency owner can then enter into a demand response program with the utility to offset peak power charges by allowing us to use that battery very infrequently to discharge when we have our system peaks. That savings to us in power procurement costs will be passed on to the agency. When you put these three together, things get much more cost competitive on things like grants, rather than everybody doing their own thing. A little bit of thought into projects will go a long way to making them happen. Okay, for cloud initiatives, we're working with Energy Northwest Grant Assistance. We've had a microgrid project in Squim that we tried to kick off, but COVID sidelined that. The state kind of shut down for a couple of years, but that's back on the table. We want to add a 100 kW battery to our community solar in Squim. And that is to keep energized with Squim Fiber Hut, which is critical for the North Peninsula communications, as well as our SCADA system, where we operate our distribution system with. As part of this project, we want to serve as a model and share technology, R&D, data, and with customers interested in similar projects. The project is essentially shovel ready. We're just looking for additional funding for this, at least partial funding, before we kick this off. We also have a longer term distribution scale battery project originally planned for load shaping to reduce power bill costs from BPA, but that's not eligible for grants, but it can be converted into a microgrid for emergency functions in the Squim area with a secondary function of shaping load with an additional financial return on that load shaping. So we re-envisioned it as a microgrid. Now this will increase project costs about $3 million. But it will potentially make this project grant funding eligible at 50 to 70%, depending on circumstances, according to what's out there now. And we have other grant projects, and these are the ones that are related to energy. Okay, I'm sorry I went a little bit long on that, but I'm going to turn it over to our power analyst, Tyler, to go through some background on the current contract.
Sean, before he starts, one thing I wanted to throw out on the North Olympic Legislative Action Committee with coffee with Colleen this morning. I'm pretty sure I heard a lobbyist mention something about a bill to fund grant writing. So grants to fund grant writing. I was going to try to follow up. I kind of missed the first part of it. I came in a little late, but I'll follow up on that to see what that's about. Okay.
All right, I'm going to discuss the Northwest Power Act, signed into law December 1980 by Jimmy Carter. This was an interstate compact to accomplish three key things: assure the go ahead and,
Could you speak a little louder?
okay. Okay. Yeah, the three key things that the Northwest Power Act established was a plan to assure the Northwest of an adequate, efficient, economical, and reliable power supply, to protect, mitigate, enhance fish and wildlife affected by hydropower dams in the Columbia River Basin. And lastly, to inform and involve the public about regional energy issues. Nicole, can you? Okay, thanks. The Northwest Power Act had several provisions. Low density discount directs BPA to provide a discount on power rates with low system densities and high distribution costs. This is very important for Clallam County. For 2022, the discount resulted in a $1.3 million savings. Unfortunately, it's likely to be lost within the next 2 to 3 years as Clallam PUD becomes more dense with more customers.
What's the threshold for, how's that measured?
It's measured in customers per pole mile. And I believe it's, I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it's, we're right on the verge of losing it. And $1.3 million is 5% of our power costs.
What was your question?
What the metric for density? It's the discount is for low density.
Okay.
And also a new large single load was established, directing that customers requesting power from the federal system pay BPA's marginal resource rate for any new or expansion of an existing load that grows 10 average megawatts or more. The rate treatment is intended to limit the relocation of large loads from other parts of the country to the Pacific Northwest that otherwise would be attracted by the low cost federal power.
Sorry, I got a question. I heard just recently that BPA does not provide any new large single load service directly to a customer.
That's actually the called a DSI, direct service.
Okay.
There's only one DSI customer currently, and that's Port Townsend Paper
In the county.
in the
Our area.
the balancing authority.
But they no longer provide new large single load service directly.
No. I mean, all the Alcoa, the large aluminum smelters.
I mean, you'd have to go through a local utility to be able to get that additional.
Correct. And it must not be federal power based on the Northwest Power Act, or at least cost-based federal power. Establishment of the Northwest Power and Conservation Council was very important for, as the council established an increase or defines, the council defined conservation as any reduction in electric power consumption as a result of any increase in the efficiency of energy use. The council outlines key considerations and necessary elements of the plan. The council gave priority to the more cost-effective measures. BPA in turn shall acquire conservation resources and implement all conservation measures as BPA determines to be consistent with the plan. The residential exchange program. It's actually a very complicated program. It's designed to address rate disparity between consumer-owned utilities and investor-owned utilities. And here is a depiction of the BPA transmission system. There are two BPA transmission service products, network integrated transmission NT service. This is Clown's current transmission service. Only used to serve customer network load. Is charged on metered network load on the hour of the monthly peak. BPA has 115 NT customers. They also provide point-to-point transmission. This is more for marketers, developers, and investor-owned utilities, customers with generation that are willing to sell on the market. The specified contract term starts on October 1st, 2011, ending date of October 31st, 2031. The transmission contract is not aligned with the power contract or other transmission customer contracts either. Transmission billing for transmission based on the BPA's monthly transmission peak, along with total kilowatt hours for the month. We have a very limited means of knowing what this peak will be, mitigating the associated transmission costs. Transmission costs were 15% of total power billing. For consideration 2028, transmission contract requires all resources 200 kW nameplate or higher to follow certain requirements. This is an area where BPA Power appears willing to change, as stated in the PO provider of choice meetings, but BPA transmission is not. However, if it's below 3 megawatts, no BPA meter is required, but the meter must meet BPA specs, and generally a short interconnect process with no studies. Here is a depiction of the Columbia River power system, the 30 dams, along with the Columbia with the Columbia generating station, the nuclear power plant.
Just a sort of a general observation about the transmission discussion here.
Okay.
We often don't talk about that as much as we do the power side of the thing. And yet it's a big driver in our cost. It's an expensive piece of infrastructure, and and if you deal with BPA and you deal with the transmission folks, it's a tough organization sometimes to deal with. And like Ken said, we're at the end of the line here, and I think maybe we need some sort of strategic dialogue, initiative, issue, whatever you want to call it. That maybe let's see how we can really take an attempt, with the help of guys like Brian and his folks, to approach BPA and say, ask them, let's get creative here. And I know everything has a cost, but okay, let's see the cost. Let's cost these things out. Let's look what they look like over 20 years and so forth. Because the way the things are sit right now, and I'm pretty sure Colleen is on the line there, and the development folks, is that we're sort of stuck, here at a certain megawatt level. And unless we get creative with some of the other stuff we talked about out here, making putting things out, power sources in our own grid that don't have to get onto the BPA grid, then we're stuck. And the development of Clallam County is going to be severely limited. And when you think about it, for 20 years, and then what, another 20 years? And so I guess my concern is that we have to somehow keep our eye on the ball on this. And this is tough because this is a complicated field, I realize. but there must be other PUDs that are, you know, worried about the same thing. And I don't know, maybe Ryan can guide us in terms of who's out there worried about the same thing, and can we pull together some a think tank or something to go do more than just sit here and respond to what this says, you know. Anyway, that's just food for this workshop that we may want to, you know, jot down and then decide on, you know, what our decision-making session, do we want to, you know, put some effort into that? Okay, thanks.
Okay, on to net requirements. By statute, BPA is required to serve cost-based power to preference customers based on net requirements. The net requirement calculation is total retail load minus dedicated resources. The FY 1228 regional dialogue power sale contract implemented BPA's net requirements obligation to supply firm requirements power to preference customer. Firm power is energy with capacity. The regional dialogue contracts included a net requirements exhibit A that lists a customer's dedicated resources. Exhibit A for Clallam included a 7% share of the Lewis County Packwood Hydro Project. Built in the 1950s, this was the Energy Northwest project. About 1% of our total power supply comes from this project.
One other, I got a call from a customer a couple days ago, you know, a public comment to, I don't know if she's here. And it's about the BPA's ability to respond to outages. And, you know, of course, the issue is their trucks are down in Poolsbo or wherever, and they're going to drive up here. And we, you know, we've heard it over and over again. We've experienced it a dozen times about this time lag between, you know, where the, you know, getting their folks up here versus, you know, something actually happening. And so another suggestion to throw into the hopper to talk about whether we want to maybe put some effort behind this is there are some creative methods where we might use shared resources, you know, individuals that are 50% funded BPA, 50% Clallam, or maybe there's a share in there for, well, I don't see Greg anymore. You know, well, there you are, you know, with City of Port Angeles or something that we, you know, we somehow design a person or persons that reside here that we can use in these emergencies, but, you know, they're also available. They, you know, their base load, you might say, is doing other stuff. Anyway, it's just, you know, something fresh to look at. I know we always say it. The labor agreements and all that kind of stuff don't let us do it, but you know, I've heard that enough. So okay, can we revisit it now since we've heard it enough? You know, it's time to go back and look at that. Because obviously that's a big part of our BPA issues, and we have the letter that we sent to BPA, and I don't know if we've got a response yet from them. And I don't know if we had that in there, but you know.
Yeah, they responded last night. It's in your inbox.
Oh, last night. Okay, they must have heard we were going to meet. Go ahead.
I think my bride I had to explain that. Their question
information on, yeah. But we've been asking for. I would say. So, there would be one whole. BPA could be nuts. I've been to that. But they all of those. And no one knew those people. And it is huge. Small.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Randy. Randy, are you available?
I'm sorry. I was just going to comment that there's a continuing problem with garbled testimony. That last person there, I could hear someone was talking but not make out any verbiage. So anything that can be done to help make that clear for us Zoom folks would be appreciated.
Go ahead, James.
I'm this is Jim Shinneman, and I could not hear it also. I'm just exactly what Randy said. It was garbled, and if there's anything you can do for us Zoom people, that'd be great.
All right, thank you, Jim. Tiered rates. Regional Dialogue produced the tiered rate methodology, and that's it looks like it's here to stay. Intent to preserve federal system costs to serve preference customer requirements at tier 1 rate with resource additions intended to serve load growth. The system size established as generation available to serve load on a monthly basis. The critical low water year was established for 1937, and it's for BP 22 and earlier. So it is recently changed. Each preference customer received a contract high water mark representing their share of the firm requirements of the tier 1 rate. Tiering gave customers the choice of how to serve load growth for resource of BPA tier 2 market-based rates. The intent was to not meld in new presumably higher cost resources, therefore not diluting the benefit of the existing system.
So I'd like to ask a question, maybe make a comment. What you just read is one of the things that I find mystifying. I mean, my understanding and the information about the federal Columbia River power system is dense through the history of legislation and various acts like we've been talking about today. So I may have missed this, but my understanding is that the BPA is mandated by federal law to provide all of the customers that they have contracts with in the region the lowest possible cost. So how do we get from a tier 1, contract high watermark amount of power to suddenly to have to pay a higher rate for load growth? And again, in our county, this is a big deal because it sort of constricts or restricts our ability to grow or to thrive economically if we have to pay higher power or future, companies or industries that are interested in coming here and developing products, selling them out of the area to bring new dollars in, but they need high quantities, high capacity power. I mean, that's a disadvantage for us. How did we get to that? Why does new load have to pay the tier 2 rate is my question. I just don't understand that. thinking.
This is Rick. Ken, I believe that there are many reasons for the tiered rate, but one of the biggest is that not all utilities grow at the same rate. And in fact, in the Northwest, there's a lot of utilities that don't have a lot of load growth. And the thought was that if you bring in new resources that are at a much higher cost and you're a very slow growing or no growth utility, then your rates are going up and it's due to the fast growing utilities. So it was a measure to help protect the slow growing utilities.
Yes, that's correct.
It may protect us as we stand today, but it restricts us from any ability to grow and thrive.
Right.
I mean, I understand what you're saying, Rick, and that makes perfect sense. And I guess that was my working assumption about the tiered rate methodology. But nonetheless, I find it, to be a problem for remote rural counties that are small markets like Clown.
Go ahead, Randy.
That works or operates from a mindset that there's only hydro. And certainly that's the way things started out. But now that we're starting to look at alternative power sources, we do need to see BPA be flexible, that where there's growth and even maybe a complementary amount of power production, they should invite that, not penalize it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just like to say that the Bonneville Tier 1 system has a fixed amount of power, and that any new loads is going to strain that system unless Bonneville is willing to augment the system and add new loads.
So I guess I'm not entirely, I've heard that said before, and I guess I'm not entirely sure what that means either.
Augment meaning
I know what augment means,
okay.
but the fixed amount of power, the contract high water marks for each of the counties or the PUDs or the subscribers totals up to the firm amount of power that they can provide.
Right.
But that's below their nameplate capacity. If they provide power above that, is it coming from other resources besides the federal, the Columbia River power system?
All of Bonneville's resources come from some select wind farms that have short contracts, and but mostly from the 30 dams and the Columbia Generation Station.
Yeah, I'll add that the majority of the Tier 2 supply is provided by BPA supply that is generated above the critical water year. So basically, they have the option to either sell that power or serve Tier 2 requirements. So they sectionalize their load and they use a market-based price due to the outcome of the regional dialogue. Many customers back then wanted to develop their own resources. Other customers wanted BPA to be responsible for that function. And BPA has generally taken a hands off throughout the regional dialogue as far as adding new loads or supplementing their system. They want to push it off either on the customers to do that or to just provide them what they refer to as their market-based rate. Some of that rate is based on market procurement, but the vast majority, if generation is in excess, is supplied by the federal hydro system. Plus,
I would add that Bonneville doesn't like to add resources, and the customers in general don't like them to, because historically they haven't done a very good job doing it. And I would ask you to look into Tenaska if you haven't heard about it.
Thank you, Rick.
Yeah, and I guess I'd like to point out that if I'm reading this right, is on this chart that the excess generation sold or its Tier 2 levels or below, it never gets below 6,000 megawatts. And so, that's a lot, what does that tell us? And we have some variability, and even the years that you quoted here, FY20, et cetera, those are even more excess generation available. And so, and being, and I don't know, let's see, we're looking at months here, 2021, 22. So, there's a strategic question in here about what do we do with this surplus money, sales or surplus power? Are we doing the right thing with it? And are we strategically thinking about it? Or are we just reacting like on the with the quarterly QBRs where we just look at, okay, our revenues are up, and expenses are flat, and therefore we're making money. But anyway, this to me has always begged the question. And there's people in this room that have busted their head over trying to figure out what is really surplus here, and who's it really matter? I mean, that blue line is what, as I understand it, is BPA's commitment to serve the tier 1 customer. And that's what the law says that they've got to do. And everything else is sort of there is just methods of disposing of surplus property. An observation that I think that warrants some attention, whether through some mechanism or group or something, I don't know. But I think it's one we throw in the basket to decide whether we want to put somebody on this or later on.
Well, I think it would be nice to have more transparency from BPA on what this all means. I mean, I feel like this is about business here, right? It's making sure revenues match expenses for the people that are operating the system. And, I guess to me, it suggests that the critical water year is sort of the baseline. That's the amount of power that BPA can reliably provide on any given year. But it seems like most years it's above that. And, what is the real cost? I mean, it seems like we're being artificially held to a critical water year level that no longer really makes sense, I guess. And I'm not worried so much that we're being shorted. I'm worried that the true cost of power is actually higher than we are led to believe it is today. I mean, the cost of power is going up. And I feel like we sort of live in denial of that. So I know this isn't on you.
Yeah, well, Brian's gonna make us feel better. So right.
Yeah, right. Yeah, as you can see for the FY 2022 in June, this is where all the surplus sales came from, where we had a huge windfall and a major surplus, and which triggered the reserves distribution clause.
Okay, let's try to move along so we can get Ryan up, listen to him.
Okay, and this is a new contract, or the new critical, or I guess the new water year. BPA went to a P10 30-year critical water year. So with a P10, there should be at least a 10% probability the generation will equal or exceed the high estimate, which is still a conservative approach, but it's much better than the 1937 critical year, as you can see from the graph. Regional dialogue core products, their slice block. BPA provides a block of power and also a slice of the BPA system in BPA shape, and the utility shapes the slice themselves and is responsible for the demand. For block, BPA just gives a block of power. And we are a load falling customer, and BPA must meet the varying demand of the customer throughout the day. Resources serving new large scale load. So there's things we can do about new large single loads. We could add dedicated resources to specifically serve that new large scale load. We could pay the BPA marginal resource rate, which runs from $62 to $90 per megawatt hour based on the time of day and the month. There is also other options, renewable resource cogeneration exception. A customer may reduce their load to less than 10 average megawatts in a consecutive 12-month period by augmenting using an on-site renewable resource. Also, could serve entire load with a consumer-owned resource if not an on-site renewable or cogeneration resource. Above rate high water mark load. Within the contract, is established a 2-year rate periods. The rate periods determine the maximum amount of tier 1 price power available to customers. So these rate periods have fluctuations. Sometimes the high water mark goes up and sometimes it goes down. It's all scaled to the original contract high water mark. Examples are planned outages for the CGS system, hydro work. There's also been incremental hydro additions that have increased supply.
And folks, from the public and so forth, this is a question I get a lot about, the price of the of power in the 2028 contract. And that's not really where that's done. It's in this process here where we're dealing with the high water marks and the 2-year the 2-year rate period. And so unfortunately, that's why we have to bother with both right now. It's a lot of work to, to try to work one, much less work two at the same time. Thanks.
So the above rate high water mark load is calculated by forecasting the retail load, then subtracting existing resources minus large single loads, then subtract out the rate period high water mark, and what you end up is your tier 2 obligation.
Yeah, so here's the irony. We tell you guys to conserve power. You go home, you put on an extra sweater and your tweed jacket and whatever. And if we actually end up not using power, we have to pay for it anyway. So, it's I am one day have this magical belief that the smart meters and AMI and all that kind of stuff will help us become a more real-time system where we can see these adjustments and not have to overshoot, undershoot. It's scales that cause us to pay or lose money.
So how do we serve our above rate high water mark load? We could use non-federal resources. Also a flat block purchase of tier 2. We did both. We purchased tier 2 and have a non-federal share of Packwood Hydro. Take or pay. This is the contract type that Bonneville has relied upon. Customers must pay for the amount of power contractually obligated. So if we do not use all of our power that has been allocated, we still have to pay for it. Bonneville can remarket the power at a remarketing rate, which is less than the rate we pay. Also, we cannot decrease contractual purchase at the tier 1 rate by adding non-federal resources. Generally, customers can add resources to serve above high water mark load, with exceptions for adding small renewable resources. So above rate high water mark load is okay to add resources, but below that it will there's no benefit. Non-federal resource thresholds. Regional dialogue contracts require resources greater than 200 kW to be, of course, in the Exhibit A contract, metered. And that helps allow the enforcement of the take or pay contract. Power and transmission contracts have the similar size thresholds. BPA wanted a minimum threshold to provide resource visibility and certainty for serving customer loads. Unfortunately, this does disincentivize small resource development. Power billing. Here are the 3 variables for our monthly billing: heavy load hours, light load hours, and demand charge. As you can see, BPA uses a form of time of use rates, and a lot of other utilities have followed suit. And the percentages are in red are related to the costs on our billing.
These are the average costs.
Yeah. Right. This is describes the complexity of BPA billing. So this is a billing construct. The dashed lines are the billing determinants, while the bars deal with the volume of power. I don't really have time to completely go through this, but I'll be available afterwards.
Say it again with the lines versus the bar.
The lines are billing determinants.
Okay.
And the bars are the volume of power. Resource support services. Right now we pay $8 per megawatt hour to shape Packwood for our portfolio. Costs for intermittent resources have been around 16 to 18 for both wind and solar. What we do know and have heard from BPA is that the more valuable the resource from a capacity and energy shape perspective, the less RSS cost. Also, larger scale generation systems tend to have lower RSS pricing also. Conservation. This is a requirement under the Northwest Power Act. Charges customers a certain cost specifically for conservation activity. The charge is priced into the monthly composite charge on our utility bills. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council defines conservation as resource equivalent to generation. Approximately 70% of this money is given back to utilities in the form of incentives called EEI funding, energy efficiency incentives. And on the back end, it's given out to customers as rebates. The BPA overheads include technical and data resources, analysis, documentation. This has been very helpful during the state audits. This allows for a third-party verification. BPA allocated $1.47 million for the 2-year period 2022-2023, funding 61% of the direct costs of conservation. Washington utilities are obligated to fund all cost-effective conservation per EIA and CETA. Financial risk mechanisms within the contract. There's the cost recovery adjustment clause that adjusts rates upward to generate additional revenue within the rate period. The crack hasn't been enacted since the energy crisis, early 2000s. Cash on hand has to drop to a negative number. Similarly, the financial reserves policy surcharge will generate additional revenue at lower thresholds. If cash drops below 60 days on hand, financial reserve policy surcharge will kick in. The reserves distribution clause will trigger if financial reserves exceed upper thresholds up to over 120 days. The administrator has sole discretion on the reserves distribution clause, whether it be given back to customers, used for fish and wildlife, or higher purposes, debt relief. And that is all.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Let me give you a microphone.
That policy about cost recovery based on conservation efforts of utilities, was that derived from within the BPA or congressionally mandated? How did that come about?
You're right, that was congressionally mandated.
Congressionally mandated.
Yes, the Northwest Power Act of 1980 established a means of it required BPA to do a certain amount of conservation, and BPA internally decided that they would fund the utilities with a certain amount of money, which is funded by utilities ratepayer money.
So what we're talking about here is something that occurred 43 years ago with a perspective that does not take into account the technological advances relating to conservation and cogeneration. It seems rather like we're being held accountable for possible poor management choices by BPA. For instance, that 15% of the cost of transmission. I'm sure Rod would like to know what kind of a rebate they get for paying 15% for the amount of time that they're not getting power since BPA isn't restoring it. What I'm hearing here is there essentially we are held on the ground by a bully. These policies reflect the ability for BPA to defend itself in terms of cash shortages and other inevitable problems that will arise, technical, environmental, contractual, but we have no say in terms of we're trying to improve our resilience by cogeneration, which amounts to conservation, which is good for everyone, but there's nothing in it for us if 30% of that effort has to go to offset what BPA might consider a potential financial risk. You see what I'm saying? I don't know why we don't ask our legislators to address some of these issues, because I think in 43 years, enough has changed now that we are not necessarily getting the major advantage here, but BPA has us essentially held hostage.
Yes, Brian, those were some of the questions that were brought up in the discussions and provider of choice. One of them being BPA's tendency to transfer risk and windfall to their customers. So it basically puts the risk back on us, and that was talked about in provider of choice meetings. All right, so what I'm going to do here is give a brief overview of provider of choice as it's occurred since the start of 2020.
Okay, make it quick. Ryan's
Yeah,
hot to go.
not advancing. Okay, this is a quick timeline. This has not changed dramatically. But the one thing is the concept paper for the end of 2021, Public Power asked that that be delayed for additional public power input. The concept paper was issued in July of last year. From that point on, the schedule is still pretty much similar, but that's where we are in the process. Okay, in early 2020, we received a questionnaire from BPA, and some of the comments from the board echo the comments from staff at that time. When they sent out the comments, we conveyed concerns: BPA cost control and market competitiveness, a total lack of effort to plan or mitigate cost in tier 2 offerings. We saw that BPA primarily worried about keeping tier 1 low. Sometimes that incurred additional cost of tier 2. But I will say we were in the minority of public power by a substantial amount. Allocation of tier 1 results is a disincentive to conservation and non-federal resource development, how it's conveyed. I can't go into all the details there, but unless there's some partial credit, you end up losing tier 1 at the end of the contract if you don't do anything. There is a mechanism to reduce and eliminate carbon supply in a timeline consistent with CETA. Being in Washington, we're worried about that. We're also worried about losing a low density discount, which is about 5% of our power bill. And we want them to change the parameters. There are a lot of utilities that fell off of the low density discount, and we don't want to fall off in the next contract. We mentioned resource integration challenges. And at the time, we favored a melded rate over the tiered methodology as an effort to get all customers in the same boat looking at the same problem. We were unsuccessful. We were a distinct minority of public power in that effort. But we moved on from this. Okay, this is a list of the provider of choice customer meetings. And I will say that staff, Tyler in particular, attended every one of these. I did most of them, and I believe 1 or 2 commissioners were in almost all of these as well. And these are the subjects that we're talking about. Ryan will go into some more detail here in a little while to help explain it. But these were the primary topics of discussion among public power and BPA. These provider choice meetings culminated at the end of 2021. And at that point, I believe BPA wanted to go on to their concept paper, but we kind of put them on hold a little while to give public power an opportunity to make comments on every one of these issues we talked about. Okay, for 2022, we had numerous provider of choice workshops attended by commissioners and staff, touching on many of the same subjects. You'll see contract high watermark scenarios, calculation, goals and principles, non-federal resources, carbon billing credits, augmentation, contract high watermark policy. These workshops went into great detail, and it was a two-way exchange of information throughout the process. Okay, more recently, we really spent a lot of time on augmentation cost analysis, firm products. What are they going to do for tier 2? We have very little information right now on that. That's something that's really hanging out there. I think Ron's going to touch on that a little bit. Non-federal thresholds and carbon, tiered rate design, system size, contract high watermark. And then going forward this year, we're going to have policy workshops associated with the draft policy scheduled for, I believe, the middle of this year. Yes, 7/23. It'll cover many of the same topics. It'll be a proposal, not a presentation of alternatives. And it will exclude some topics in the concept paper because they're going to sideline residential exchange program, which will be covered in a separate workshop.
Yeah, one observation, and I guess I can get Ryan to, correct me if I'm wrong, but, I attended a lot of these and I noticed that Clallam County, either with staff and commissioners, was highly participative and relative to other PUDs. And so, I don't know, you saw the smorgasbord, but, we seem to have a presence there that, we kept at it and trying to learn and so forth.
My impression is that meets commissioners and staff.
Doesn't seem to be helping though, does it?
Yeah, they're not too successful.
But I'll say staff take leads from the commission. If the commissioner had no interest at all, I mean, we might not have 2 or 3 people on it, so it's a good thing. And we're involved, we're up to date, commissioner's up to date.
I appreciate it.
Okay, so concept paper, got past that. Now we're looking at the final policy and record of decision. There'll be far more workshops throughout 24 and 25 until you get to the contract policy and actually starting to sign and execute documents. So we still have a long way to go. Okay, this is a summary of the major topics discussed throughout provider of choice. The first ones I haven't read, I think Ron's going to spend a little bit of time on because in many respects, they're the most important to our utility, the biggest cost impact, biggest consequential impact. And we may talk a little bit more about some of the cost management, cost control of BPA itself. You know, they convey their risk to their customers. Everyone knows that. Non-resource development thresholds, contract term and contract flexibility. There's a lot of other topics that Tyler touched on in his presentation. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Ron Neal. Basically, Clallam is a small customer of BPA, about 1%. And when we're within WAPAG, we're one of the big fish at 28% of the supply. It's very important for that relationship. And I will say that out of all the individuals I've dealt with on provider of choice discussions and regional dialogue, I believe Ryan is more engaged and knowledgeable than anyone else I know about involved.
Definitely.
Top 3 at least. Yeah, Ryan.
Great. You're going to put my slides up. Okay, great. So first, maybe I'll introduce myself. My name is Ryan Neal. I represent the Western Public Agency Group. And so the first question you might have is, who is WAPAG, right? What are we? Well, we're a collection of 23 preference customers of the Bonneville Power Administration, 21 of which are located in the state of Washington. 2 are located in Oregon. We're located both east and west of the Cascades. And I can tell you there are different views east and west of the Cascades among utilities. WAPAG includes some of Bonneville's absolute smallest customers, less than 1 average megawatt. Very tiny, as well as some of the largest Bonneville customers. So we're a very diverse group. So what we strive to do is to listen and seek compromise where we can and advocate in areas where we have come to some kind of agreement. And then we also acknowledge every utility's individual autonomy to do what it needs to do to protect its interests and argue on its own behalf. And so that's kind of our perspective on things. And we're very proud to have Clallam PUD as a member for as long as I think WAPAG's been around. So I've been asked to talk about provider of choice. Those are the next Bonneville contracts. I think a little context before we dig into the slides. Looking back at the prior presentation, if you go back to slide 34, and there's a discussion about net requirements, and that's really fundamental to everything that you guys are talking about today. So what does that mean? Under Section 5B of the Northwest Power Act, the district has an absolute right to put its net requirements on Bonneville, and Bonneville has a duty to serve it. So what is your net requirements? It's the district's total retail load minus its dedicated resources, right? That remainder, you have the right to put on Bonneville. So if you have no other resources, you can go to Bonneville and say, serve this need. And if Bonneville doesn't have sufficient resources today to do that, Bonneville's obligated to go out there and acquire them so you can be served. So as you look at your resiliency and other resources, Bonneville's an important piece of the puzzle, right? Because they're there as a backstop to the extent you're unable to do it yourself. The provider of choice contract in any Bonneville contract is the contractual mechanism that Bonneville uses to deliver on its obligation to you. So that's what we're talking about. The current Bonneville contracts, they're known as the regional dialogue contracts, expire on September 30th, 2028. So as we've just talked about, the provider of choice process is BPA's initiative for developing the next contracts. And, you know, this has been going on. We've been negotiating the next contract since 2019 through 2020. We're going to need the whole time, frankly. It's a complex issue. There's a lot of stakeholders involved, 135 preference customers. There's a whole region of interest groups and other stakeholders that want to make sure that Bonneville meets carbon obligations, implements conservation, do a whole host of other needed and necessary things. So I've been participating as part of WAPAG on a couple levels. One, I interact with Bonneville, but almost as importantly, I've been working with other public power utilities and groups, right? It's easy to think of this negotiation as bilateral. Clallam PUD and BPA, but really fundamentally, it's a multi-party negotiation between public power, all 135 utilities, each of which represent their own communities with their own interests and needs, and then also with Bonneville. So it's very, very complex. And I can tell you that every one of those 135 communities are having similar discussions as to what you're having today. Maybe their needs are different and their challenges are different, but they have engaged folks just like here that are worried about the future. So back, I guess I would say we started in the summer of 2021. Public power, all 135 utilities and trade groups started thinking, well, we'd rather have a first crack at our own post-28 concept paper than have BPA kind of set the terms by going first. And so we tried to negotiate and did negotiate, develop a public power post-2028 concept paper. And if you want to see it, I believe the district has it, but I'm happy to share it again. But it was about 40 pages of materials, talked a lot about the stuff we talked about here, kind of a vision for the future and what we wanted out of the next contract. What I have here are the principles that we were able to come to. And as you can imagine, when you have 135 different entities involved, just coming to agreement on these types of principles was a significant achievement, frankly. But I hope they're not a huge surprise. They may deviate in some places for what the district would want for itself. But you know, once we were able to do this, it really kind of gave us a guiding star for how we wanted to develop the rest of the paper. There's still a significant interest in low rates. They still matter, right? Despite all the other challenges we're trying to address, low rates still matter. We want to ensure that the contracts adhere to Bonneville's statutory right to serve the needs of its preference customers. They've got to be adaptable contracts. Things are changing almost by the second. Organized markets are coming into play, regulatory changes, and involving end user needs. Folks want different things today when they turn on the lights. And maybe it's not just turning on the lights that they're trying to achieve with their power. And so we want to be able to do the contracts that allow Bonneville's customers to meet their end users' needs. We need to be able to meet our statutory compliance requirements, including CETA here in the state of Washington. Almost all utilities are very interested in the low carbon attributes of the federal system. So it used to be that the true benefit of preference power from Bonneville was that it was the cheapest power around, generally. But now that's coupled with its low carbon attributes. And so it's becoming an even more valuable right than it was historically. And that's due to things like CETA. The final contracts need to be broadly acceptable to public power. And in this last point here, facilitate the development and integration of non-federal resources by preference customers. And I think that's kind of what you guys are talking about today, is what can we do to bring on our own resources in our own local community? And that's a big part of the discussion. Things like this RSS, you heard that in the prior presentation, resource support services. So when you develop a intermittent resource, a solar resource in your community, and you saw the 200 kW threshold, if right now, if your new resource is 1 megawatt, Bonneville requires you to purchase resource support services from Bonneville. That adds another $18 per megawatt hour, depending on the resource. So it makes them more expensive, right? And so what are the ways we can do to reduce that cost? Well, one is you can increase that 200 kW threshold to 1 megawatt, which is one of the things that Bonneville is proposing to do. So there are things that are happening in this process to help you achieve your objectives already. Next slide, please. Oh, that's me. So, after Public Power issued its concept paper, Bonneville came back with one of its own. And these are, there's a lot to these contracts. You can't fit them all in one slide or even in one presentation, but here are the general terms that Bonneville came back with. 20-year term contracts. So the regional dialogue contracts are 20-year terms, and Bonneville's looking to do that again. And I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Oh, 3 parts. All right, 3 parts.
John Conrath. I'd like to know why we cannot negotiate for, let's say, a 10-year contract. That's the first part. Why is it not possible for us to negotiate as an individual PUD with BPA? And okay, and the last question is, legally, what does long-term mean?
Okay, well, let's take the last one first.
Okay.
So the longest term contract that Bonneville.
I just want to know what long-term by itself means legally.
I'm about to tell you. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So the longest term contract that Bonneville can enter into is 20 years. So legally speaking, long-term is 20 years under the framework we're working in.
But, they are allowed to negotiate long-term contracts, but there's no minimum. It doesn't, nowhere in there does it say it can't be 1 year.
Yeah, there's no minimum. There's a cap on how long they can be.
Okay,
Exactly.
so could we negotiate for a 10-year contract?
There have been in the past 10-year contracts. And so, yes, is it possible to do that? It can be done. I can tell you, that the demand in the region from other utilities in the region is for something as close to 20 as they can get.
Well, if we could negotiate by ourselves with BPA, that would be a different story. Then it wouldn't matter what they were looking for.
Right. And so if you look on the bullets here, Bonneville is looking to provide standardized contracts for all of its customers.
No, I understand what they want.
Yeah.
I understand that. But it's just interesting that a year ago, they came out with the concept paper and they were very interested in cost management. If I could read something to you, this is less than a year ago. There is too much change facing us now to allow another 20-year offering to be the basis for our contract unless there are cost management terms embedded in the agreement. Key contract elements such as term, contract reopeners, off-ramps, and cost caps need to be discussed in earnest and reflected in the cost management mechanisms. And they list 2.
That I don't believe Bonneville wrote that. Who's that from?
Well, it says
It's the concept paper from.
that's not from okay. Well,
Yeah, that's what customers are asking for.
okay, I couldn't read the code here then.
Yep. Okay, and I'm sorry, what was?
Okay, so you're saying that this is not BPA, so it doesn't apply.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So again, these are what Bonneville asked for. The contracts themselves would be executed in 2025. You wouldn't actually take service under those contracts until 2028. And so the idea is that you would take those 3 years and get ready to implement the contracts. And I can tell you the last time around, it was a similar framework for the regional dialogue contracts. The contracts went into effect in 2012. You signed them in about 2009 in that time frame. And it took 3 years to develop the implementation to do that. Go ahead.
Limitations, I'm sorry, Brian Grad here. So under the proposed terms in general, they're required to provide preferred customers the lowest rate. What dictates that rate? Are there exigencies where they could essentially, increase that rate 10, 20, 30%.
Yeah. So the probably the biggest restriction is the rates have to be cost-based. Right. So Bonneville doesn't charge us preference customers a market-based rate to earn a profit. And so they have to determine prior to each rate period, what they project their costs will be for the next 2-year period. Right. And so they go through an extended process called the integrated program review, where they go, and it's extensive. They look at their capital costs, their projected O&M costs related to what we talked about, the residential exchange, and they sum it up. And they say, okay, based on the sum total of our revenue requirement and our projected sales, this is the rate that we're going to charge for the next 2-year rate period. So the biggest restriction is that cost-based element.
So would you consider a biological opinion a cost-based requirement that would be transferred to the ratepayer? For instance, aside from simply being endangered, it's definitely determined that species are going extinct. And the only thing that's to be done is breach a dam, for instance, lose that power capacity. Is that cost shifted onto the consumer? Is that a cost that's considered, is it considered a cost at all?
So the Fish and Wildlife budget that Bonneville has is included as part of the revenue requirement, right? So those costs that Bonneville expends to meet its obligations under the biological opinion are part of the revenue requirement recovered through rates. I think the answer to your question is yes, that is part of the calculation.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions? Right. So Bonneville's proposal again is to have the same contract term, an effective and expiration date for all customers. They are open to a 19-year contract term rather than a 20-year contract term. And that's chiefly to accommodate the transition that'll happen in 2045 under CETA. So in 2045, all Washington utilities will need to be completely carbon free. And that'll be a big change starting that year. And for those utilities that currently have carbon emitting resources as part of their resource portfolio, as one of their dedicated resources, they're going to need some kind of accommodation to make that transition. And then finally, and this is something that Tyler did speak to, Bonneville's further proposing that the contracts be take or pay. So if you sign up for 45 megawatts, you pay for it whether you use it or not. And that's to protect, from Bonneville's perspective, to ensure it can meet its obligation to pay for the cost of the federal system. I see Randy's got a raised hand, so.
Fine, thanks. Just for context, can you give us a brief history of the durations of past contracts? I think you said the previous one was 10 years. Was it that much or shorter durations than the past?
Yeah, Randy, good question. So I'll be frank, the prior contracts to the regional dialogue predate me, but here's my understanding. So the first contract under the Northwest Power Act was entered into around 1980, 1981. That was a 20-year contract. That was followed by, I think, the subscription contract, which was a 10-year contract. And then after the subscription contract, we entered into regional dialogue. So since the Northwest Power Act, the contracts have ranged from 10 to 20 years.
Thank you.
So I've been asked to just focus on a few of the topics that we're talking about in the provider of choice. And it's one that we had quite a bit of discussion on before. Oh, there we go. And the first one is tier 1 system size and allocation. So as we've gone through this process, the first question that was top in my mind is, are we going to continue with this tiered rate construct? Right. And I very much put this question to the utilities I work for. Hey, do we want to go back to a melded rate? And even maybe suggested that would be an idea to consider. And the overwhelming response that I received from the utilities I work for, with a few exceptions, was that they liked the tiered rate construct. Yeah, Clow and PUV being one of the big ones. And that's the same response that Bonneville's heard from this larger public power community. So to your question, why do we have tiered rates? The answer is because customers asked for it. And it was largely an outgrowth of the energy crisis in the early 2000s, right? That bad experience where Bonneville actually had a lot of customers had left Bonneville. They decided they could do it better and cheaper than Bonneville. And so they left Bonneville. And the energy crisis came. And all those customers came back. And Bonneville had to go out and acquire to fill the gap. And it was terribly expensive and terribly hard. And out of that experience, Public Power came back to Bonneville and said, hey, for the next big contracts, these regional dialogue contracts, we want you to implement tiered rates. And so one, it came from Public Power, the request to tier the system like we have it today. And when we were given a chance to revisit that decision, the overwhelming response that Bonneville's heard to date anyway, has been that we'd like to continue to tiered rate construct. So once that decision's made, it really kind of, you picked your path, right? It's an important decision. It is a fork in the road, and it really leads to two fundamental questions. The one is, if we're going to tiered rates, what will the size of the tier one system be during the provider of choice contracts? Do we just leave it as it is? Do we want to grow it a little bit? And that's question number one. And then the second one, which is actually, I think, turned out to be the harder one, is, okay, if we're going to tiered rates, how do we allocate the tier one system for the next contracts? And I can tell you, based on the last 2 years, it was a lot easier, I think, and I wasn't there, to create tiered rates than it is to continue it into a next contract. Very difficult to reallocate something after it's already been allocated. And you say, well, why do we need to reallocate it? Well, that's because circumstances have changed. Utilities and communities are in different places than they were back in 2008, 2010. We have some utilities that have experienced extraordinary load growth. And they're looking at that $60, so that $63 tier two power right now, which is almost a doubling of what it was for the prior 2 year rate period. And they want to get as much tier one as they can get. That is a price signal pushing them and pushing them to advocate for more tier one. We have other utilities that have lost a lot of load. Some of those in the local community, right? And so they want to preserve what we call tier one headroom. The headroom, the tier one that they have currently allocated, they want to hold on to as much as they can, because it is an economic opportunity for them to be able to say, hey, come to our community. We have this $35 megawatt power that we can use to help you grow your business and grow our community, right? We also have utilities that have done a lot of conservation, a ton of conservation. And what that does is, when you have a utility that is particularly good at conservation, is it has driven down their load and created headroom for them. And they too want to preserve that headroom based on their conservation they've achieved. And so we have some utilities that want more tier one. We have some utilities that have spare tier one. And how do we allocate that based on these differently situated utilities? It's been very difficult to do.
So,
yeah,
a couple of questions or comments, I guess. First off, the reality is the same contract for every utility across the system, across a really broad ranging set of communities with very different standards of living, costs of living, is intended by federal mandate to be fair, but it's fundamentally unfair that we all pay the same rates. For the Seattle metro area to be paying the same rates that we pay here, when their standard of living is 4, 5, 6 times as high as ours, is problematic, quite honestly. So that's just an observation. In the context of one contract suits all. The question I have is, first question I have is, with the tiered rate methodology, I mean, if the assumed drivers are correct, that by 2050, the demand for power is going to double. By 2045, by 2040, in all likelihood, if the assumed drivers are correct, the demand will actually be more than doubled. If history teaches us anything, not less or not right on that mark. So by 2040, let's say it doubles. You know, the Federal Columbia River Power System, you know, the dam system, you know, where today we get 85, 87% of our power from that system, you know, could be as low as 35%. So while our demand is continuing to grow, what happens to the tier 1 system then? Do we start paying tier 2 rates as soon as it starts going, as soon as Bonneville has to start buying power from other resources to meet their obligations? Did that make sense? I'm not sure
I think I tracked it, and let me try to respond, and we'll see how it goes. I think your observation that loads are expected to grow in the region due to electrification, for example, is accurate. I mean, that's the forecast.
I think it's a done deal.
Yeah,
change doesn't happen slowly. The change has already occurred.
Right. And so a couple of things. One, the tier 1 system was always intended to be kind of the base, the low cost piece of the resource puzzle, right? And in fact, when they entered into the regional dialogue contracts, they fully expected for loads to grow above the tier 1 allocations very quickly for most utilities, but it didn't happen. And that was due to a variety of different reasons. One of which was the 2008 recession. If you think about what happened here, so the way they set these high water marks, so they came up with the regional dialogue policy in about 2005, 2006. And they said, we're going to pick 2008 as the test year. We're going to measure everybody's load during 2008. And that's what we're going to use to set their contract high water marks. What they didn't expect to happen was a recession. And that pushed everybody's load, that critical year for the measurement, down. And so everybody got lower contract high water marks than they expected they would get, unfortunately. But the loads didn't rebound like they expected. They just haven't grown as high as they were forecasting back in 2006 and 2007. So that's observation 1. The other thing to know is that when electrification hits, it won't hit all communities at the same time, right? Or in the same way. So the Seattles of the world will probably go first, and given their density, they will probably have their loads go up faster than other communities. Those communities outside the I-5 corridor will be later in time in electrification. And so if we had a melded rate under those circumstances, communities outside the I-5 corridor would be asked to pay for Seattle going first in electrification. And we would be waiting for electrification to really hit their communities later on. So you can see a scenario where your rates will go up, your loads will stay flat, but your rates are going up to pay for the electrification somewhere else. And so by the time electrification gets to you, you will have had an extended period of time where you've paid a higher rate to benefit others and their load growth. And then, and only then, will you be the beneficiary of the melded construct. And so is there still some benefit to a community like yours from tiered rates? Well, you know better than I do, it's your community, but there is some possibility that it could still be of benefit. And that's part of the idea, is that you will not be required under a tiered rate construct to pay for somebody else's load growth. That's the whole idea.
Well, quite honestly, what you just said, I understand, and I think it makes sense as an analysis, but it compounds our problem of being constricted and restricted from economic opportunity, quite honestly. So not only are we paying more to cover the cost of other communities' electrification, it adds cost to our cost of living and makes it that much harder for us to attract new business here that generates dollars and brings them in from the outside. You know, I mean, it's a vicious cycle, a vicious circle for small, remote rural counties.
Yeah, and when you throw in, you know, we recognize this, what Ken just described, a year and a half ago. And of course, BPA at that time said, oh, we hadn't got to that part of the discussion yet. And now it's like, oh, that happened a year ago. We don't have time. You know, it's like shifted the block. But that was okay. If you can't mess with the tier one system and so forth in terms of its size, then what is the cost of the tier one system? Can something be done about that? And the answer theoretically is yes, of course. You using good cost control methods like asset management that's tied to real assets and so forth can be used to ferret out the winners and the losers in BPA's hydro system. Not all dams are created equal. Not all power resources are created equal. But Ken pointed out that, Hanford is, I forget the number, 60 or something or whatever. But anyway, it's a lot more than the 36. And so if they're tying your hands on what you can do with a lot of these other initiatives, we need an aggressive cost management team that is composed of BPA and Corps of Engineer and Bureau of Reclamation people, and those that are smart enough to not be bamboozled by them to, look at their cost and get inside of that. And so I don't know, Russ Snyder from your staff and I, of course, have had conversations, and unfortunately I had some downtime with an illness last summer, so I've kind of lost the ball. I don't know. What do you think about that? Is it worth trying to pursue? I mean, I found the Corps, in my experience, is you can work with them, and you just have to take the effort to get it planned, get it sit down and get it scheduled. And, they'll give you all the reasons in the world not to do something, but you just be persistent with them and you'll get there.
Yeah, well, I think what I said before is that low rates still matter, right? They still very much matter to communities all over the Northwest, low rates. And I think cost management remains an important element of this discussion. How do we guarantee or try to ensure that the rates are as low as they reasonably can be? And I think we've even heard a few of the ideas. Off ramps potentially is one way to do that. Ensuring that Bonneville maximizes its ability to secure secondary revenue. So that, remember the graphs we had where we had the critical water, the solid lines at the bottom, and then we had the years 2018, 2019, 2020, and they were all dashed lines, and it showed the amounts above critical water. Well, that's the water, that's the secondary sales that Bonneville makes on the market currently at extraordinarily high prices, and is one of the reasons that Bonneville just recently triggered a revenue distribution clause of $500 million. $350 million of that is coming back to utilities. So one way to help ensure Bonneville's lowest rates is to make sure that the contractual agreement that we come to ensures as much of that secondary revenue comes back to preference customers as possible, because that's how it reduces the rates. That's what helps them keep them low. And there's always the possibility that somebody else might find another use for those funds. That money attracts a lot of folks that have a lot of needs of their own that they want to use that money for. And if your priority is to ensure the lowest possible rate, then you should be interested in making sure that there's the contractual mechanisms that ensure that those secondary revenues come back as an offset.
And true, and I want to make the point that it's not just tier 2, it's tier 1 prices. I mean, if you do cost control, you're gonna get the numbers that affect tier 1 and tier 2. In other words, you'll see, and then it's a matter of what do you do with the tier 2 price or the tier 2 cost.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about tier 2 here in a minute, and the way tier 2 will most likely work in the future is that Bonneville will go out and enter into power purchase agreements for a particular resource. Maybe it's a wind resource or a solar farm with a battery. And those costs will basically be the cost of that agreement passed through to customers as a tier 2 rate. Yeah.
So that's what I was trying to get at, and I'm worried about, by 2040, 2050, if the demand for power doubles. I mean, I think I heard you say that, small market, remote rural counties like ours aren't gonna electrify as fast as everybody else, so we don't have to worry about it. We'll go backwards and we'll catch up later, I guess. Well, I don't think I agree with that for one thing. And I certainly hope that's not the case for another. Because I think, we will grow proportionately with rest of the region as we electrify everything. So what you just said is the problem I have is, BPA's critical high water firm power is based on the hydro system, period. And there's only so much water there to produce only so much energy. What's going to happen when the demand for energy way exceeds that capacity? Does that, I think what you just said suggests to me it all becomes tier 2. They have to go out and augment the system. They have to acquire additional resources, which is normally today would become tier 2 resource prices, right?
Well, Ken, this is Rick.
Yeah.
I think it will be up to the customers whether they want Bonneville to do that or not. There's, like I've said before, Bonneville hasn't had a good track record of acquiring resources. And what I'm afraid is going to end up happening is that the large public utilities are going to go off and develop their own resources. And if that will leave then the small ones trying to figure out how they're going to meet their load growth. But, I guess what I'm just trying to give you a little caution that it may not be in our interest for Bonneville to go out and acquire resources, at least not without some type of public oversight or cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and that may be true. I trust your experience and judgment, but we would still be penalized for going out and sourcing resources on our own for the RSS, right? I mean, we would have to pay a premium for Bonneville to manage the resources and the transmission of those resources.
Yeah. So Rick's right. Once you have consumed all of your tier 1 allocation, your contract high water mark, you'll have an election to make, as will any other utility in the same situation, to either have to put that additional need on Bonneville, in which case Bonneville will serve it with a tier 2 product. And we'll talk about the options there in a minute, or acquire your own non-federal resource and bring it to your own load to serve that need instead. Now to your point, well, Bonneville is Bonneville penalizing utilities to develop their own resources through the use of resource support services? I will say you still need resource support services to bring those resources to your load. It's not just because there's a need to, but hold on one second. The other thing is if a resource support services are needed for resources that Bonneville acquires for tier 2 purposes, that is then also built into that tier 2 rate.
I guess I get all that, and that makes sense. That would make sense in the past or history to date. Excuse me, we're facing unprecedented growth in demand for electricity. I mean, the world has changed and is rapidly changing even more. So, I mean, it just doesn't seem to make sense to me that we have to sign it. I mean, the thing is, Clallam County is like completely married to BPA because all of our power comes from them, all but a very small percentage. So if our demand for power doubles, they're not going to be able to meet that under the tier 1 contract high water mark, right? I mean, we'll have to find the power somewhere else. And under a 20-year contract, we would have no off ramp to go do that without being penalized. We would have to pay for the resource management of those additional sources because they can't provide it, not because we're just growing unexpectedly. It's because the demand is growing uniformly across the region. I mean, there's a difference here. Maybe I'm not expressing it very clearly, but I see a real disconnect between the intent and the purpose and the value of a 20-year contract previously compared to the next 20 years.
And that is obviously your perspective, Commissioner. I will say that not all utilities in the region share that perspective. They actually see a value in a 20-year contract and are asking for it. And so
But they're not dependent 100% on BPA energy to meet their demands. Many of them.
I would say most of them are. I would say it's actually the opposite case where there are very few utilities that have their own resources. Most of Bonneville's customers are full requirements customers served by Bonneville presently.
And this commissioner supports a 20-year contract.
We have some, I've got a question. I've been waiting here. So is Colleen.
Is that James? Go ahead, James.
That is James, yes. So just a point of information, what is Column County's megawatt usage per year? And also what is the tier 1 allocation for Column? And what is the tier 2 allocation for Column at this point? I don't know any of that.
Yeah, this is John. Our requirements is about 77 average megawatts. With the new P 1030, we have a tier 2 obligation of about 1.4 average megawatts. And according to our projections, we're going to grow about 31% over the next 25 to 30 years, primarily due to electrification. We don't have to convert gas heating to electricity. So our increase is going to be much lower than any utility that has large gas distribution.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're saying that 77%, 77 megawatts are used yearly at this point? That's normative?
That is correct.
Okay. And so as part of it drops into tier 2 to the point of 1.4 megawatts?
Yes, under BP 24, it is looking like 1.4 average megawatts, which is a lot lower than it was in BP 22, which was more like 5 or 6 average megawatts, because the change in critical water year took us way back into tier 1, what previously were served for tier 2. And that was true for most utilities that had above contract high watermark load.
Thank you.
And then Colleen.
Yes, thank you. Ryan, first off, thanks for your presentation. It's been really enlightening, but can you share where Clallam PUD lies on the spectrum relative to the other 134 utilities over the last 20 years, relative first to the load growth or load loss that has occurred in Clallam County, and then secondly, the level of conservation we've achieved?
Yeah, actually, I have slides on that a little bit later in my presentation. And if I don't hit the mark, could you please just ask the question again? But I think I'll largely address those questions in subsequent slides.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So how are contract high water marks calculated? Well, the contract high water marks for the current regional dialogue contracts were calculated using basically the net requirements formula. So what they did is they took 2008 loads, they subtracted any new large single loads that a utility might have had, and then they subtracted that utility's 2006 dedicated resources. So for Clallam PUD, it was your 2008 load minus, I believe, Packwood. You have a portion of Packwood to calculate your current contract high watermark. And so what do they plan to do for the next contracts? And this is still very much in development. There have been no decisions made by anyone, but Bonneville just this last week came out with a new proposal. And that proposal is to use each customer's load from 2023. So the relevant year under this proposal is this year, right? Reduced by the customer's dedicated resources as of 2023. So again, as of this year, minus the customer's new large single loads, and then adjusted by a weatherization normalization. And then there's going to be some adjustments made to it. So they're going to compare, first, they're going to do an upward adjustment based on 50% of each utility's self-funded conservation savings from 2012 to 2023. So we talked about in the earlier presentation, Bonneville's conservation program, right? Bonneville has a public power conservation target that's set by the Northwest Power Council. And what Bonneville does in setting rates is it assumes that 70% of that target will be funded by Bonneville, and that the balance, the remaining 30%, will be self-funded by customers individually. And so to the extent a utility has self-funded conservation, and not all of them do, Bonneville proposes to give that customer a credit based on the amount of self-funded conservation achieved during the time period, but only 50% of it. And Clallam PUD is a beneficiary of that because you guys do your own self-funded conservation. Not every utility does. In fact, most don't. The next adjustment is Bonneville is going to compare the utility's current regional dialogue contract high watermark, determine how much its load exceeds that amount today. So how much load growth has it had since the contract high watermarks were set in 2010? And it's going to give an upward adjustment of 25% of that amount. So you're going to get a little bit of acknowledgement if you've had load growth during the regional dialogue contracts in setting your new contract high watermark.
So 25% above the contract high watermark for this year.
It's per day. Okay. You got it. And then we have a utility that's going to be returning that we did not have a regional dialogue contract, grant PUD, and so they're going to get a special adjustment for them.
How does that affect us?
Under this proposal, it does not impact you. It could have in a different scenario, but the way they've run it, it actually will not impact you. So hopefully this answers Colleen's question, but where does Clallam PUD stand? So you have here kind of all of Bonneville's preference customers. And the way to read this slide is the folks on the left, the far left, have tier 1 headroom currently. So they are not using their full allocation of their contract high watermark presently, right? The folks on the right, they have above rate period high watermark load. They've experienced load growth during the regional dialogue contract. I think the most remarkable thing here, at least from my perspective, is how many utilities are flat. They haven't lost load. They haven't grown. They're really quite flat. And I include Clallam PUD in that. I mean, you have some, a little bit of above rate period high watermark load, but it isn't as much as many others. So you're right in the middle. So what happens under Bonneville's proposal? Well, what you see happen, before we focus on Clallam PUD, you'll notice that the folks on the left have significantly less headroom, right? And that's due to the contract high watermark reset that Bonneville's proposing. They're proposing to take that headroom and redistribute it to the folks that were on the right on the prior slide. They're reallocating it. So what this has done is it's taken about 570 average megawatts of tier 1 headroom and given it to the folks on the right. Now, you see that we still have a few utilities with tier 1 headroom. Those are the utilities that have self-funded conservation from 2012 to 2023. And you'll see that Clallam PUD is one of those. So that 1.21 average megawatts of headroom. So before you had above rate period high watermark load, now you have headroom to grow into, is due to the good work at the utility to do self-funded conservation. Any questions on this? Okay. So that's Bonneville's most recent proposal on how to reallocate the system. And Bonneville's, now let's focus on the system size. And so Bonneville's proposal is to fix the system size equal to the sum of the recalculated high water marks. So we calculate everybody's new high water mark, we sum them up. And right now, based on the forecasts, that means that the system size would be about 6,957 average megawatts. And Bonneville says, hey, in the event that the actual calculation produces an amount higher than that, we're going to cap it at 6,993. So in a situation where we go through 2023, and if the numbers actually add up to 7,200, Bonneville's proposal is to scale down all of the contract high watermarks until it equals the size of 6,993 average megawatts. There's two ways to do it. The first way is a pro rata reduction to everybody across the board, right? Everybody's numbers come down. The other way to do it, and honestly, the way I think is the most fair to those utilities that lost headroom, that the folks that lost that 570 average megawatts of headroom, is to only apply the reduction to those folks that have load growth. Because the folks on the far left have already given up quite a bit, a lot. And so those are the two options that are currently under consideration. Now, public power is generally interested in increasing the size of the tier 1 system. That the numbers we just saw, they're largely dissatisfied with. And so there's a lot of talk about increasing the size to something between 7,000 and 7,500. I won't read every bullet on here, but there's an opportunity. The extended power up rate, or the proposed extended power up rate at the Columbia Generating Station, would provide about 150 average megawatts at a price lower than the current tier 1 price, right? And so this gives us an opportunity to grow the size of the system and potentially reduce its cost modestly, just given the numbers. But these types of opportunities don't present themselves very often. And so current modeling indicates that a tier 1 system size of about 7,250 average megawatts is the sweet spot. You can grow the system up to that size without increasing the tier 1 rate. And so that's right now what WAPAG's proposing to do, because it respects the lowest possible rate to the extent we can, the tiered rate construct. But there's if we do augmentation, our proposal is that because every utility would be paying for the cost of that augmentation in the form of their tier 1 rate, that every utility should also benefit from it in the form of a pro rata sharing of the augmentation. So what does that look like for Clallam PUD? If we do that, if we grow the system to 7,250 megawatts and then share the benefits of that augmentation pro rata, you can see that Clallam PUD gets an additional 3 average megawatts to grow into over time, and is actually done, compared to most of the other utilities in the region, would start the next contract in a fairly good place. And this is the proposal that WAPAG has, when I put it to the group, overwhelmingly endorsed.
Okay, so Ryan, I often get asked this question, and it may sound naive, but maybe not, in the great scheme of things, given the language in the Power Act that said the Fed, BPA shall provide power to public preference customers. What happens if a PUD or 2 or 3 got together or just independently and decided, and we're not going to sign the contract? We're just going to let things go as they're going right now. In other words, assuming nothing changes. I mean, I don't have an answer when they ask me that question. Other than, well, I've heard other lights are going to go off. No, I don't think the lights are going to go off. I think that we see some serious negotiations going on and trying to get to the crux of the issue. But, is there a fundamental basis, must have reason that a contract must exist? Or, I realize the main reason that you have it is to ensure that everybody gets a fair share of that 7,000 megawatts. Mm-hmm. But just say for discussion's sake, somebody decided, I'm not going to sign, but still expect service. Hmm? Is that not going to sign the contract, but still expect Bonneville to serve the load? The law says they still got to provide the power.
But I don't think I think to be a preferred customer, you have to have a contract. That's all the law says. It doesn't say the same contract as everybody else. It doesn't say a 20-year contract. You have to have a contract with Bonneville to be a preferred customer.
Yeah, you have to read the statute together, right? And the statute clearly contemplates that there would be a contract. It wouldn't be in place to implement the 5B obligation. So I think ultimately there's going to be a contract. I've heard the point. Why do we all have to have the same contract? It's really a policy reason more than anything. And it's Bonneville's, but I will say that it had customer support. And so how did things used to work, right? Before regional dialogue, there are always the worry about somebody getting the better deal, right? That was always the concern. Is this utility getting the better deal than my utility? And it could be any number of different terms or conditions that somebody else might want. And I just don't have the transparency to see into your contract and see if that's the case.
And it caused a lot of heartache in public power, because as Ryan was saying, it caused suspicion between utilities, because they were sure that Snohomish was cutting a better deal for their irrigation water than Umatilla was. And it really did cause, from my perspective, a lot of heartache in public power.
Yeah, I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
Rick, are you talking about all the utilities not operating under the same contract cause that concerns? I think that's what.
I think, well, or it could have been the same contract with different exhibits, right? And just implemented differently. And so I think a lot of the questions you guys are asking, why are we doing it from a public power perspective, it's kind of look in the mirror, because some of this is what we asked for. Because of these past concerns of things that happen maybe behind closed doors that people didn't want to try to extinguish in the current contracts. And you can still see these themes rolling through in the provider of choice. Yep, go ahead, Randy.
So Commissioner or General Manager Worthington was quoted in a public meeting as saying that the BPA is well aware that we have some of the worst service in the entire Northwest, given our geographic location and the fact that we're also a radial line, a single line of service. So we have more outages than practically anybody else. So we have less, a reduced level of service from that. In addition, we are designated as at the front of the list of load shedding should there be problems with power transmission elsewhere. So if Seattle needs extra power for some emergency needs, they're going to get it, and we're going to get our power outage. What would you say to the fact that we are getting a lower level of service compared to other PUDs, and how could we be compensated for that?
And Randy, I don't think it's right either. If I lived here, I would. I can't say that's right at all. So I think it's a fair argument or a fair concern, and I have no. I won't defend Bonneville on that point at all, and I think it's something that you should continue to raise with them and encourage others to raise on your behalf.
Well, that's a good example of an exhibit we could augment our same contract with everybody else's, that they would take steps to help allow our line crews to fix their problems instead of waiting forever, which we've asked. My understanding has been that question's been asked many times, correct, Sean?
Yeah, but the law says that without a tailboard, our guys cannot work on that system. And in order to have a tailboard, we have to have their crew on site. So it doesn't save us any time if we're allowed to work on it. So what we do is we patrol the lines, find where the issue is, and relay that to Bonneville. So when their crews get here, they come prepared with the right staffing and with the right materials.
Well, or someone in the audience suggested that they send people to this side of the canal so that they're readily available when we know a storm system is coming and there's a high probability that.
And I believe Bonneville would probably be open to that if we funded it. So, yeah.
So, I'm sorry. So in this entire discussion, the policy, the forecast, it's all looking towards stability of the system. If individual PUDs are part of that system, what are the guarantees that we have against failures on BPA's side? What guarantees does BPA provide to its clientele other than the models that it provides that forecast the cost of electricity? We all know that climate change is going to make things hotter on the east side of the state. It's going to be a greater demand for AC over there. We all know that water is going to be short in many areas in the summer. And even though, and I find this difficult to believe, we're not considered a wildfire risk according to the governor and other agencies in the state, the risk of so much power exposed to fire in this region is extreme. We know that. And we could anticipate outages for, well, who knows, depending on the availability of components, transformers in particular. What I'm saying here is it seems like we are assigned a greater amount of risk, even in this assumed stabilization of a 20-year contract. Now, you referred to off-ramps. Is it possible there's some kind of a decoupling mechanism wherein if our costs rise above a certain threshold that's agreed upon, that we could be cut loose?
That is a proposal as old as time. And it really is not a new concept from a Bonneville perspective. It's something that customers have honestly asked for, I think, in every contract negotiation. And it's always been what I think is a good idea for all the reasons that you just discussed. The trouble has been in the implementation. And let me kind of demonstrate the point. Okay, let's take a large utility in the region, Snohomish PUD, or a Seattle PUD, or a Seattle City Light rather. Those utilities have more options, as we've all kind of acknowledged today. They're larger, they have more resources, they have their own resources. Their location on the transmission system is also advantageous. In a situation where we include an off-ramp, right, and it triggers, they're the ones that are best situated to exercise the off-ramp. Most other utilities aren't in the region, frankly. As much as they would like to be, it's very difficult to do. And so what happens when a Seattle City Light or a Snohomish PUD exercise their off-ramp rights in a situation where Bonneville's already struggling financially, right? Bonneville's costs will largely stay the same, but they will be spread across a smaller set of billing determinants, including your utilities billing determinants. And so what that means for everybody that's left, the ones that aren't able to exercise the off-ramp, is that your costs go up. That's the struggle. Because Bonneville's rates have to be set to recover its costs.
Just as we have federal flood insurance, is it possible for an insurance program to be established that offers protection against some kind of failure on the part of BPA that basically puts PUDs underwater, where they have to borrow huge sums of money to maintain their ability to provide power?
Interesting idea. May come to that someday.
Yeah, and maybe rather than me tackle that one, we could put that one on the list.
Yeah. Okay, Ryan, you finished?
Almost done. I'm happy to stop here. I do have other items, but I know we're running short on time. So here are the forecasted rate impacts and headroom from these two proposals. I think this died. I think this wants the clicker wants to stop as well. So do you mind transitioning? Oh, there we go. So I think the key here is, what do we do with the load above the high water marks? There's really two options. You can use your own non-federal resources, whether you acquire them or purchase them, or you can put the obligation on Bonneville. And if you put it on Bonneville, there's different ways to do it. You could ask Bonneville to acquire a certain type of resource, whether it's a solar resource or a wind resource. You could ask them just to go out in the market and acquire it. But those options are still under discussion, and we have them here. And then finally, I think we can't talk about the future without talking about carbon and environmental obligations. There's an overwhelming demand, particularly among Washington and Oregon utilities, but also in other communities, for carbon-free resources and carbon-free product from Bonneville. As we talked about earlier, there is an element of carbon attributed to Bonneville's system based on those unspecified resources. And so we are actively trying to work out ways to lower that carbon content to the extent we are able, and give customers a chance or an opportunity to have a carbon-free product from Bonneville. But that is a struggle, just given the variability of the federal system as it is. There are times when Bonneville has to go out and acquire unspecified resources just to keep the lights on. So I can stop there and let the sides speak for themselves.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Any further public comments?
By these standing bodies of water because of organic material that's washed down the river and sits down there and just basically rots. So that should be noted.
Okay, noted. And I guess that ties into the last point he had on a chart there. Okay, so what we, thanks Ryan for great presentation. Give Ryan a hand. It's a very complicated and tricky subject, and no one knows it better than Ryan, and he takes us through it and tries to make it straightforward enough for us to grasp. And so that when we commissioners have to sign these contracts in a couple of years, we have some confidence in what we're doing. And we also know where the loopholes are that need to be addressed. And hopefully, I guess it would be my intent is that we've identified loopholes and that we're, looking at them and working on them and so forth. And so Ken is sort of a progression of the previous discussions about strategic plan, when it wasn't enough, wasn't broad enough for this kind of discussion. And then we said we do a hybrid or an addendum kind of plan. And I think the material here could be rolled up into that in a way that it's a whole set of strategic ideas, but with not any way to sign them to them. And then I think the commissioners then will have to go through that and kind of ferret out, okay, which ones do we want to go after, considering that, it's staff time and all that kind of stuff. Does that sound about right? Yeah. Okay, good. Then that's what we'll do. We'll, you guys work on putting all this stuff together on paper and so forth, and we'll go from there. Well, and yes.
You have Randy with a question there?
We have a question?
Yes.
Oh, Randy.
A little more comments and questions. Transparency is so important at a time when you're looking at tiers, basically, and BPA does not set a good example of addressing those tiers because they are not very transparent. The reason they've never explained why they group together all their power sources and don't break it out so that we can all understand more about what costs are individually attributed to each power station. I do really appreciate your efforts toward more transparency with the public here, the ratepayers, and also suggest that maybe staff in projecting the future, there's risks inherent with that. It's risk management. So I certainly would like to see more of a bracketed projection when they do their analysis, so we can understand both maximum and minimum, as well as what they then determine should be, you know, the target when with their numbers on power usage and such.
Thank you for pointing that out. That's actually been a point of discussion in the past in terms of asset management being disconnected at BPA from their QBR processes and their other processes, at looking at how they're doing financially. And what myself and others have looked at is bring the QBR process, or at least make the asset management plan take the analysis to the project level, so that you know the value of each project in the system. And then that way you can make some critical decision and choices. To do that, though, may require, you know, some extra effort on somebody's part to organize something like that and put it in place as maybe a WAPAG initiative or somebody's initiative later on. All right, thanks.
Yeah, before we finished, or before Commissioner Waddell gavels, I just want to thank staff, Sean. It's been a long afternoon, John, and everyone that's been here. It was really helpful for me, and I really appreciate all of our local government partners. That it looks like almost everybody was represented here, all the cities and the EDC and the port. And so I just appreciate all of the attendance. So thank you all very much. And Ryan, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very helpful for me to understand the issues better. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. Rick, would you like to say anything? Guess not. This meeting is adjourned.